All right. Good morning, everyone. We're here. This is our 5th anniversary NCRN conference. We're very excited to be here that we've made it 5 years. I feel like we should give ourselves a round of applause for that. So, just a couple of very quick logistical announcemements before I launch into what will be the first presentation of the day. Will just be kind of an overview of what we've done as a network, some of our accomplishments for the benefit of those of you who are relatively new to our community. And that will transition us into later on in the morning a discussion around strategic planning and where we as a network want to go, hopefully for the next 5 years and beyond. So in terms of just logistics, if you need Wi-Fi, you want to connect to the one that's called G Wireless. Oh no, sorry, G Connect. And that will you have to enter a phone number and some stuff, but you will get online. Also, a quick programming note on our agenda. We unfortunately were not able to print off agendas yesterday because our office is actually closed right now due to the protests on the main campus. In hindsight, we dodged a bullet holding the conference over here at the beautiful Mount Vernon campus where we have, we can be serenaded by birds and instead of, protest chants. But there were, if you need to consult the agenda, you can find it on the Rutgers NCRN website. Rutgers has done a great job of building a new website for us and keeping it up to date. We're very appreciative, obviously, for all that Rutgers has brought into this collaboration that's helping us move forward with the NCRN for at least the next 2 years and hopefully much longer. But you can access that if you need a link to that agenda. There are some QR codes at the registration table, and we'll keep that up to date. And also on the agenda, so we're going to change the break that was originally between the two panels on non-degree quality. We're going to move that forward, actually, to right after we have that strategic planning discussion, just to give everybody some time to, react in small groups and think about and reflect a little bit on what we discussed there. So without further ado, just a little bit of level setting about how we got here. It's not ancient history. We're only going back 5 years, so maybe the choice of background was a little bit hyperbolic, but we have accomplished a fair bit, I think, over the last 5 years. I thought would be worth going through. So right now, the NCRN is a collaboration between George Washington University and Rutgers University Education and Employment Research Center, led by Michelle Van Noy and her team here. You might have met Trey, Tracy, and others from Rutgers this morning. So they've done a great job of helping us with some of the logistics of running the network and also contributed a lot of ideas to our agenda. Very grateful for the collaboration. It's really helping us pull everything together for you all here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kyle Albert. I'm an associate research professor with George Washington University in the program on skills, credentials, and workforce policy, PSCWP. That's sort of an umbrella for policy researchers who are doing work on things related to workforce and credentialing within what we call GWIP, which is the George Washington Institute of Public Policy. We are co-located with, but not administratively part of the School of Public Affairs, Public Administration, UW. So I thought I'd say a little bit about kind of the origins of the NCRN, how we got here. Going back 5 years, going back to that first meeting, which was held, I think, in April 2019 in this room. At that time, there had been a longstanding recognition that non-degree credentials were sort of a blind spot in not just in policymaking, but also in research. That we knew that there were many credentials out there, many certifications had been around. We'd had IT I can think back to my childhood, remembering those ads on late night Simpsons reruns. Earn your IT certification, back in the 90s. So not a new phenomenon by any means, but definitely a time of increasing attention to non-degree credentials, non-degree pathways. Yet we had no hard national data really up until around that time, around even just what the prevalence of certifications were, what percentage of Americans actually have a certification or a certificate, an occupational license, or have completed an apprenticeship program, anything that we consider within this umbrella of non-degree credentials. And that's actually would be a whole nother slide I should have had about just how do we define non-degree credentials. basically non-degree, certification, certificate programs, occupational licenses, apprenticeships, badges, definitely. Within certificate programs, we think of credit and non-credit, boot camps, all kinds of different programs out there. So it's really quite a big universe of credentials we're talking about. This came at a time in 2019 when the Lumina made its first investment in the NCRN. This was a time that we were building on, I think Lumina and other funders were building on a number of early successful investments to kind of help map that credentialing ecosystem and landscape. We had the Credentialing Transparency Initiative that was launched and incubated by GW, by our institute, and eventually grew into the National Nonprofit Credential Engine that many of you are familiar with. There were other big initiatives around that time, like connecting credentials. And I think we were kind of building on that tradition of trying to figure out how do we make sense of this landscape, answer some basic questions about quality and value. Obviously, Lumina Foundation has had a goal of, I think it's about 60% of Americans. Frank is giving me the nod. I got it right. 60% of Americans will have a high quality credential by the year 2025. But for Lumina, they've always wanted to know, well, what is a high quality credential, right? Are certificates of sufficient quality that they actually provide that pathway into the middle class, into livable wages, economic mobility. And I think that funding, I don't want to put words in our program officers' mouths, but I think that, funding us at that time was part of trying to find the answer to that. We were also at a time when there was federal government was collecting data for the first time through this thing called Gemini, which was the Interagency Working Group on Expanded Measures of Enrollment and Attainment, a bit of a mouthful. But we had a number of federal surveys where they were adding items about credential attainment and some rudimentary sort of indicators of credential value. So we were getting some research data in, also not on my slide, but we also had state longitudinal data systems really taken off around that time, and other national survey efforts. Growing interest in alternatives baccalaureate degrees. This was sort of a time I think the College for All movement arguably had kind of peaked, and there was increasing interest in public discourse again around non-degree pathways. And at this time, we were coming off of in 2016, 2017, 2018, there was already an informal network of researchers that were meeting regularly in the DC area. Steve Crawford, who was a research professor, he was the original PI on the network grant, and he passed away a couple of years ago, although certainly his spirit is still very much with our community. He was instrumental in organizing some of those early meetings that were informal. Some of the organizations like New America, I think Georgetown, WorkCred came together, and obviously GW were coming together already to exchange ideas. So our vision when we had that original grant, we received that grant in 2018, held our first meeting here in this room in 2019. We thought that we would create sort of a curated community of researchers who would interact with carefully selected practitioners. And that we would engineer a sort of dialogue that would hopefully move the field forward. It was led by Steve Crawford and myself. And we had an advisory council for that early grant that includes many people who are still in the room today. I think Michelle, you were on that. Jeff, you were on that early advisory council. So was Roy Swift, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because of a health issue, although he sends his regards, and I understand he's doing quite well. We thought at the time that the field would benefit from greater coordination. This guy on the slide is an American physicist, John Platt. He was working in the late 50s, early 60s. He published some work about why do some academic fields stagnate and others advance. And his observation was that some fields are simply better coordinated than others. That there's fields where there's a central sort of organization or effort among researchers to come together and coordinate seem to be making more progress on central questions, scientific questions than others. And with that insight, that's really that's what we were hoping to do with the NCRN on some level, was to build interest in non-degree credentialing research, but also set an agenda for the field. We envisioned that stakeholders would come and guide researchers towards a common research agenda. We had different formats in the early meetings. We kind of tried what would work. We had 3 total meetings before before the world shut down in 2020. We actually had a very ambitious plan of holding, I think, 5 in-person meetings in 2019 and 2020. It was the idea that we would kind of jumpstart this dialogue. Obviously, we made it to January 2020. We're very lucky we got that last in-person meeting in January 2020. Was not a super spreader event to our knowledge, thankfully. Um, thankfully. Uh, but this first meeting in this room again was more of a tradition. It was where we had panels, and the idea there was more that practitioners and stakeholders would talk to the researchers, and researchers would learn. And then the other meetings we had in the summer 2019 and January 2020, it was more researchers coming together, figure out amongst ourselves how do we put together a research agenda. And we also aim to, and we have produced some reports that have summarized some of our findings and hopefully kind of driven the field forward. I'm not going to read out on this slide. Just to recap kind of where we have been collectively over the last 5 years. There's been several major national and world events that have shaped the research agendas of many of us and have certainly been in the background in our discussions. Obviously COVID's a big one, but we can think about even today we're having protests on campus. There's social movements. There's all kinds of things going on that may sometimes directly influence non-degree credentials, but definitely have an indirect influence on the political and social climate in the country that affects many things, from support for our work and support for our research to affecting the actual research questions that we choose and pursue. A few things that I didn't make the slide, but I could have mentioned. We seem to be entering a period of great power competition, certainly increased emphasis on industrial policy in the United States, and policymakers are thinking about how do non-degree credentials fit into industrial policy and ensuring the workforce is appropriately skilled. Social media has obviously become an important source of career information for many young people. All kinds of things out there that influence our work. And those influences definitely have affected the agenda. When you compare what we were talking about 5 years ago to what we're talking about today, there have been changes, some of them subtle, in what we talk about in our meetings, what we hold, the topics that come up when we solicit webinar speakers, and the conversations that we have as a community. There's new data systems people are taking advantage of. Credential quality seems to be growing in importance in the research agenda. Skills-based hiring, STARS was not an acronym that what you would have recognized in that meeting back in 2019. Obviously, today everybody's talking about it. Incremental credentialing, credential as you go movement has been obviously had a major impact on our field. So lots going on. Again, just a quick timeline here. In 2018, we had that initial grant where we tried to kind of formalize what we were doing with that informal sub-baccalaureate network. 2019, we had a large meeting in this room, then a smaller meeting in the summer. 2020, we managed to get through that meeting right before COVID hit. Then we kind of moved towards a webinar series. We did monthly webinars in 2020 and 2021. We were able to stretch out a grant a little bit with obviously not having the same level of travel spending, which was fortunate for us in some ways. In 2021, we received a new grant to grow and continue to do our work and actually expand and upscale some of our work. And we also submitted as a footnote, we did submit a big grant proposal to the National Science Foundation in early 2021 to hold an international conference and network that we thought would bring together non-degree credential researchers from all over the world. That proposal was not successful, although we made a lot of international ties in the process of trying to obtain that grant. And we certainly are still thinking about that. How can we engage with people in other countries and other parts of the world where researchers are thinking about the same issues that we're dealing with here in the United States. 2022, we got to a couple of in-person meetings. We'll lose Stephen Crawford, unfortunately, sadly, in May 2022. But we did have a relationship with the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness for the last year of that grant cycle too, to help us with some of the meetings. And then 2023, last year was our largest spring meeting yet. Some of you remember our mystery speaker, ChatGPT. Yeah, that was our mystery speaker. So, we definitely this was a time again when, world was changing and how we do research was changing, right? And then this year, we do have a grant from Lumina that is allowing us to again offer this meeting and a meeting without charging a registration fee, which has been great. They've given us great support, and we're extremely appreciative. And we have funding guaranteed for another meeting next spring. And we'll continue to do webinars and continue to operate while we also go through a strategic planning process that we'll talk about in our next kind of session. Just a quick reminder, we have put out a few reports. Some of these reports, the links have been transferred over to the new Rutgers website, but some of them are also archived on the GW Institute of Public Policy website as well. We did a couple of major reports on kind of the landscape of the field, themes that were coming up in our meetings, where was the research community coming together, and what were people emphasizing, and what were the pressing research questions. And then we also, this was a great idea, by the way. I'll give credit to Holly Zanville for suggesting that we go in the direction of doing these conference compendiums in 2022 and 2023, where we took the transcripts of these conferences and annotated them, made them a little bit more reader friendly, and put them together. So that was actually sort of user generated content, if you will, where we had great summaries of the different panel discussions, and you can also find those online. So I will transition now to a few minutes to let Michelle Van Noy. As I mentioned, Michelle and her team at Rutgers have partnered with us on this conference, and on our current grant cycle, they're helping us with a lot of aspects, not just the logistics of the meeting, but intellectually helping us on our agenda. So Michelle, if you want to say a few words, and then we'll transition over to Stephanie and the discussion on strategic planning.
Thank you, Kyle, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm not going to spend too much time talking, but I just did want to say hello and thank everybody for being here, and thank Kyle for inviting us in to partner on this effort in terms of leading the NCRN and being here today. And I also just want to share a couple of memories from that early time of NCRN. There's a few of us who've been around since the very beginning, but I remember being here 5 years ago as we were thinking about what this group would be and what it would look like. And I do have to just channel Steve Crawford for a minute, because one of my favorite memories of Steve was in this room. It was a very sunny day, and he was unveiling the name of this group because it was transitioning from that informal group of researchers to the NCRN. And I won't try and do what Steve did, because Steve was a lot funnier and cooler than I am, but he noted that the NCRN could be sang to the tune of YMCA, and how that would be a very good rationale for picking that name. And so it always sticks with me when I think about the name of NCRN and that first meeting and Steve and his wonderful playful nature. And that was really fun. And it's cool that, this is living on and we're continuing on that mission that Steve started out with us. So take a moment later and see if you can redo that moment, that theme, because that was really fun. Another member I just also wanted to recognize too, in terms of like a leader in our field who was part of the network in the early days, is David Bills from the University of Iowa. And he, I think, when we think about credentialing and the study of credentialing, he was really a leader in this field. And so many of you, I'm sure, know his work, but for me, it's certainly, a really strong foundation for us to think about as we do this work. There aren't a lot of scholars in this field who do that work, and David was one of them. And unfortunately, we also lost him in the past few years since the beginning of the network. So I also want to recognize his important contributions to our work as we look into the future, which is kind of where this meeting is going. And, we're really excited to be working with Kyle to think about kind of where the NCRN is going to go in the future. I do remember at that first early meeting, there was we had a group of researchers, we had policymakers, practitioners, and we were thinking about how this was all going to come together. I think we kind of evolved into creating a very coherent community of researchers, which I think has been really great and robust. But we've always had that initial mission of how do we connect this better to policy and practice. So I feel like that's a big theme that we're thinking about and will drive our future potentially. And then we heard from all of you, and I don't want to give away the feedback that Stephanie Murphy has for us, because we were very pleased to be partnering with HCM Strategies to help us kind of structure and guide a strategic planning process for where the network is going to go in the future. Where does everyone want this to go? Where is this going to benefit the field most? And also, how can we think about moving our sustainability? So those are all things that we really appreciate Stephanie and HCM help with. So without further ado, I'll let Stephanie, who's the Director of State Policy Research at HCM, I'll turn things over to her to share some of the findings from our the work that she's done with us.